you need to understand the urban landscape before you can ask an urban ecological question about that landscape. But we happily dive into a national park or a protected area is probably more problematic without asking the community, what is the importance for that question? You know, a great example is, you know, reintroduction of wolves. You know, we as ecologists can see all these answers as to why we need to reintroduce wolves, and then we're startled when the community is not in alignment with what we're thinking about. And the second thing, which I think is more important, especially with global climate change, is climate justice and environmental justice issues. I think and we actually just got a paper accepted, yay, which we'll publish soon in Ecological Applications, is about this issue of blindness to environmental justice questions. Ecologists are great at going out and studying all sorts of crazy stuff and failing to notify a community that might have an environmental justice associated with the very process they're studying. And the last in that same thing of this voice is the lack of access to that knowledge. So Standing Rock, a great example. So Standing Rock had so many complicated ecological issues associated with it that community needed access to, and hopefully, well, I won't get into politics, if things shift around, they'll actually will go back and do the EIS that needs to be done, that was not done. But a lot of that issues was on fisheries, subsistence hunting, and the 2 endangered species that were in the area, whereas the social media focused on water and upstream versus downstream. So there was an ecological thing going on there that did not get addressed. And that's what the EIS was supposed to, that was what the lawsuit was about, was actually under the subsistence hunting and not under water access. So that's the issue of voice, is when the questions are co-produced, then the question has immediate use for that community. It engages students who are interested in that community. There's so many questions you could ask about New York City that would get students excited about ecology. I was so I'm a kid from Brooklyn, obviously, but the other day when I was back in New York, well before the pandemic, you know, walking down a street in Brooklyn, Atlantic Avenue, and a dragonfly goes by. Now, as an ecologist, you're like, holy crap, where'd that come from? You know, most of the city kids may not have noticed it, but that was a restoration of the river landscape, the river finally being clean enough where you could actually get dragonfly larvae coming. There's all this other ecological processes that are part of that dragonfly cruising up, you know, Atlantic Avenue, and hopefully didn't get taken out by the B-28 bus that went by. But the fact that this dragonfly is an ecological process. Does that community have access to that ecological process? And think of all the little kids you could get excited with a butterfly net running up and down Atlantic Avenue to do ecology and look at biodiversity just by that one incident. So that's what I mean by voice. It's providing that voice in the context, co-creating knowledge that excites a community, gets a community engaged. And sort of last thing, oh, sorry, we're live. Last thing on the same question is that this generation of students has a voice that we don't yet use in enough, and that is their cell phones. Every cell phone is this little scientific device in their back pockets that is full of all sorts of apps that does pretty amazing things. You know, between identifying bird calls to identifying any plant and butterfly or bug out there with sometimes not the greatest accuracy, but at least it's the fact that it can do it. So how do we engage those students? Their tools are in their back pockets. So us providing them the ability to create that question wherever they are, it doesn't matter anymore because they have a cell phone. They can do all sorts of crazy things with that cell phone. And we should encourage that to get them into biodiversity and biosciences. So that was a really long answer to your question, Janine.
Thank you so much. That really helps.
So thanks, everyone. I think we're gonna keep going with the panel discussion. And so I guess, Miguel, you can start and share your screen.
Yeah, welcome everyone, and thank you for the presentation, Julian. It was really great, and thank you everyone for attending this session. So we're going to go for the second part of this today's session. So it's diversifying biodiversity science. So for this second part, we encourage you to actually use the hashtags that we have here on the screen. And yeah, for this session, we are going to be I am a Mexican doctoral candidate in San Jose dos Campos, Brazil, where I came just after I worked in Mexico as a research assistant and consultant. And after I conclude an Erasmus Mundus master's degree in Europe. And with me would be also Lucy. She's a French researcher currently doing a postdoc in Oldenburg, Germany, which she started after she concluded a postdoc in Norman, Oklahoma, when she joined the RCN.
Thanks, Miguel. And so I guess, so first of all, thanks for being here, everyone. I'm going to give you a few informations about how it's going to go. Then we will introduce the different speakers, and then we'll ask them questions. So you've seen that the event is live streamed now on YouTube. So for the people who are on YouTube, I'm going to introduce the RCN a little bit. It's an NSF-funded research coordination network that brings together scientists working on a common theme and trying to get them a step further in the research around this theme. And in our case, our work is focused on understanding diversity and the processes shaping it at different scale across temporal, spatial, and also taxonomic scales. I think we would also like to thank, first of all, the RCN organizers, so Anna, Renato, Betty, and Janine, who really not just gave us the opportunity to be part of this panel, but really empowered us to be in charge of it. And hopefully we did a not too bad job at organizing it. And I would like also to take some time to thank the people you don't see here, but who helped us to organize the event. So it's Caroline, Crystal, Daniel, Jesus, Sean, and Soleil. And so now some technical details. So we are going to ask a first round of questions to our speakers. During this time, feel free to ask your questions. You don't have to wait for us to be done. That's kind of one of the perks to do everything online. So to ask the questions, there are different ways. If you're following us from the YouTube live, you can ask your question in the chat, but you might have to sign up either with a YouTube account or a Google account. If you don't have one, you can use the hashtags to ask your questions on Twitter. We have people watching the hashtags on Twitter, so we should get your questions. If you're in the Zoom meeting, which is the case for the people from the RCN, just ask your question either directly in the chat, or you can also ask your question to Danielle. So Danielle's gonna say hi. Yeah, here it is. So just don't hesitate to ask your question to him directly. If you don't want everyone to see your question, that's perfectly fine. So also, whenever you have a question, please let us know to which speaker you would like to address it, or if it's a more general question, but you can definitely address it to someone in particular. And so, yeah, for the people in the Zoom call, please mute yourself and turn your camera off while we're asking the first round of questions. And so, yeah, I think that's it for the technical aspect of the event. So I think we don't need the sharing screen anymore. And I'm gonna start to introduce, oh no, we actually do why we are introducing people. I'm so sorry. But so I'm gonna start to introduce our speaker, and I'm gonna start with Seema, who is a first-generation American trained as a herpetologist and evolutionary biologist, currently tackling the challenge of making mainstream healthcare more data-driven by incorporating routine genetic testing. As a biologist, she strove to understand natural patterns of diversity in the context of evolutionary history and environmental factors. Currently, she strives to highlight the many careers paths available to biodiversity scientists and the value that diverse perspectives of researchers and STEM brings. She is a data scientist and co-lead of the Women in Tech group at Invite, where she develops programs and elevates resources to support groups that are underrepresented in STEM. Her works include making STEM and STEM adjacent role more visible and attainable to youth from underrepresented backgrounds, and designing pathway for people to transition to more technical roles. She is also a technical advisor at Insight Data Science, where she mentors PhD students and postdocs interested in applying their academic skill sets to problem in industry. And with that, I'm going to let Miguel introduce Beatriz.
Yeah, so I will introduce Beatriz. She's a postdoctoral fellow in ecology, evolution, and behavior at the University of Minnesota, fellow in philosophy of science at the UMN. She's communications and outreach chair and social chair within the steering committee of the postdoctoral association of the UMN. She's involved in several outreach and volunteering activities to make accessible science content in Spanish. So we can go for the next one, which is Gillian.
So I'm gonna introduce Gillian, who's been introduced earlier by Betty, but I'm gonna do it again. So Gillian is an associate professor at Colorado State University. She is a Black woman in ecology and was trained as an artist. And to her, art is an essential part of balance against being a scientist in a field that is less than welcoming to people of color. And in particular, she likes to think that ecology has endless opportunities to be represented in art, whether with real organisms like bees or the organism we would like to be at the time. And she definitely mentioned dragon.
So the next person who is going to be participating with us is Lilian. Is a postdoc at the University of Campinas in Brazil, and junior associate editor in the Journal of Applied Ecology. She's part of a feminist and female-led Latin American non-governmental organization, the Rede Cunha Asset, which aims to reduce gender inequalities in academia. Collectively, RKA promotes discussions and provides intellectual and emotional support to female scientists and the different career stages, encouraging and fostering the participation of younger women and girls, especially those from ethnic minorities in science.
Our next speaker is Ruth, who loves data and who has been raised by a historian of science, her dad, who taught her that there is no science with a capital S, but that what we learn and the ways we learn about the natural world are culturally driven ventures. It's all part of the here and now of our current culture, and we should always strive to see those cultural biases in our science. She is a professor, director of the graduate degree program in ecology, and co-chair committee on gender equity on the faculty at Colorado State University. She is working to diversify the graduate program by, for instance, training people with privileged identities, and aims to dismantle white patriarchal cultural and institutional structures. Colorado State University has only one group focused on gender equity at the moment, and it has a main stated focus on faculty members. As a co-chair of that group, she feels it's important to focus beyond the faculty to support students and staff members, and also to make sure that our approach is considered the most marginalized and aren't tailored for white women only.
And last but not least, we have also Emilio, who is a professor at the University of Florida with adjoining appointments in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation and Center for Latin American Studies. Much of his work is dedicated to the broader recognition of the representation of scientists from the global south in the academic institutions and communities. For 6 years, he served as editor-in-chief of Biotropica, and he's a president-elect of the ATBC Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. And of course, none of this would have been possible without the minority group graduate and postdoctoral fellowships from NSF and a dissertation fellowship for the minority students from the Ford Foundation. So yeah, so now we're going to start asking specific questions to our panelists. So yeah, and I will give the word to Lucy to start with this conversation.
So thanks, Miguel. So the first question that we have is for Emilio. So you you're really involved in the whole editorial process. And so I think that's something that is a big part of our job as scientists, and that might be a little bit overlooked in the question of diversity in academia. Do you feel it's something where we could actually take more actions that would be different than what we think about usually?
Hi, everybody, and thanks for the question. Thanks to our other participants. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. I do think it's important, and I think it's an underappreciated and very small group of very powerful gatekeepers in science, right? That actually make decisions about what gets the stamp of approval. One of the things that editors do, if you read about the sociology of science, is that they confer validity not just on the research that's done, but on the researchers who are doing it, right? And it's not only a gatekeeper role, but it's also a status role. A lot of tenure and promotion guidelines, for instance, in the United States, if you're going from associate to full, even assistant to associate, they ask for indicators of prominence, and a lot of them will have as an example that you've been invited to serve on the editorial board of a journal. And so I think this is a really valuable one because it doesn't depend on things like developing a pipeline or having large numbers. The number of editors for journals is really small, and there's a great place to go and look for potential editors. It's the authors of articles in their journal. And so, and it's also something that depends on basically one or a very small number of people to really take decisive action, and that's the editor-in-chief of the journal. And so, one person has to make the decision that they're going to have broader representation, gender representation, geographic representation, disciplinary representation, whatever it may be. And then they have to do the hard work of going out and inviting those people, finding them. But it's entirely possible to do, and it's entirely possible to do quickly. And as a member of an academic society that publishes a journal, I'll also tell you that you can also push your society's journal to make those changes if you find that the editor or the editorial board isn't responsive, right? So society journals are supposed to be responsive to the membership of the society that publishes them. And so I think it's a really great place in which the impacts can be immediate, they can be large, and they can be driven either very easily top down or bottom up in ways that other kinds of changes related to diversity in academia can't be.
Thank you, Emilio. So we have another question, and this one is for Gillian. So we know that you are a scientist who has been working so hard with biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, national parks, sustainability, and also climate change negotiations. So, however, you have been always very interested in the inclusiveness of minority groups. So our questions could be more related to what were the main challenges that you faced when you start working in the projects that focus on minority groups? How did you face those challenges, and how has been that journey been?
Thank you for that question, Miguel. And hopefully my video will work for a little bit. And thanks again for the student panel for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm very excited for so the national parks are interesting places. And I wanted to say, I agree with Emilio, because the national parks in the same way are gatekeepers as to who visits them and who participates in a park, because the parks tell the stories. And they tell the stories of the park itself, and that story often contains characters, and those characters can change the landscape of inviting different people to be part of that park. Which story you tell is chosen by a park, and how that story is told can be a gatekeeper to who even thinks about that. So, part of the passion of bringing students to national parks and diversifying students engaged in the national parks is to make sure that those stories are told, so that that student or whoever who comes to a national park feels welcome in that national park. And the one way I like to think about it is that all landscapes have culture. And we tend to forget that, and other cultures don't. But in the US, that we seem to forget that every piece of landscape here has cultures, and those cultures are really deep. And those cultures have changed over time, where they were Native American at one point, where there were Black settlers at another point, and they are now, a totally white town. The town of Deerfield, Colorado is a good example of that, that has gone through several different racial identities over its time. So I think by telling that story helps reconnect people to the landscapes that have their own histories and stories in that, and helps make that landscape be more of a special place. So when we take students to Yellowstone National Park, I think one of the most important things to do is to tell them the story of the Buffalo Soldiers who went through that park. And then not only the Buffalo Soldiers who went through those parks, but the Buffalo Soldiers who rode bicycles to get to that park in the 1890s. And all of a sudden you've opened up all these questions for those students of, wait, what? A Black guy from St. Louis, Missouri rode a bike to Yellowstone in Montana in the 1890s before any roads were out there. What was that person's story? And that helps connect them to the biology. So you have to first open that door to someone belonging in that environment or feeling they belong in that environment. And then the biology just blossoms behind it.
Thanks for this answer. The next question is for Lilian, and it's one that is about the current health crisis we're going through, and especially we know that a lot of people, like we've all been impacted by the ongoing crisis, but minorities especially, and that's something we can see in terms of economy and other aspects. But do you feel that that's something that is even more true in academia? And so we were curious about your opinion about that.
Okay. Hi, Lucy. Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in such an exciting panel alongside such big names. Thank you a lot for the invitation. And the question that you pose is actually pretty interesting, because the COVID-19 pandemic poses major challenges for all sectors of society, including scientists. Suddenly, everybody's faced up with abrupt disruptions and redirections of research. However, I believe that the consequences of this crisis will disproportionately affect early career researchers, especially those from communities that are historically underrepresented, disadvantaged, and or discriminated in the fields of environmental sciences. Those include women, researchers from the Global South, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+, and non-binary gender identities, as well as persons with disabilities. The sudden increase in responsibilities for family care, teaching, supervision, and administration particularly risks scientists from specific groups to become severely overburdened. For example, women are often more responsible for service and student mentorship than their male colleagues, resulting in increased overloads and fewer opportunities for career advancement in the years to come. In addition, scientists with limited financial or technological resources who depend on temporary income or visas, for example, for their work are at a highly vulnerable situation and often need support to pursue their educational and career opportunities. Specifically related to the COVID-19, inequalities based on racism and discrimination, such as the instances of racist attacks on people of Asian descent since the spread of the coronavirus, will most likely affect the international scientific community, not only in the next weeks or months, but over the long term. Those structural inequalities, they already existed pre-pandemic. We all agree in that. but they were magnified. I feel like additional layers of oppression were created on early career researchers, especially those from low-income countries or those belonging to visible minorities. Less likely to have established careers, they or we, postdocs, early career researchers, junior researchers, we are vulnerable to the funding cuts and the unemployment rates that are expected to arise from the pandemics, right? So years of effort to create a more diverse scientific community are thus threatened. And scientific community as a whole risks losing research talent and rising stars who belong to these vulnerable groups. So yes, simplifying this big question, yes, I believe that COVID crisis has affected efforts to foster diversity.
Thank you, Lilian. That was an excellent answer. So we have an additional question for Ruth. So as a minority student heading into graduate school and noticing that there is a lack of diversity in the graduate student body, how can we prepare or engage the minority undergraduate student body to increase the participation in the graduate programs? How are you creating a community in the graduate school that makes minority students feel welcome and have a sense of belonging? So do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think, well, first I want to say, like the others, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. This is great, and I'm really enjoying learning from everybody. I think that one thing in terms of encouraging undergraduate students to enter graduate school in the ecological sciences is there's this huge barrier of academia itself. And as we heard from Gillian, there are so few minoritized, ethnically and racially minoritized people in the earth sciences overall, that most of those people probably will not be familiar with this bizarre culture that is academic science. And so that culture is something that needs to be explained and translated. It's a very, very white culture. And so there's that whole aspect of it that needs to also be broken down. But it's just, there's no way that people would know, for example, that most research degrees in the ecological sciences are going to be things where you're paid half-time and get to do your research half-time and don't have to go into debt for the degree. So I think that there's just no way people would know that. And so I think that there's some basic things, just deconstructing some of that and how it works. And then getting folks, undergraduates, into research experiences, providing funding, paying people to be involved in research is really crucial for showing what can be done, and that there are actually some pretty interesting careers along those lines that they might not have known of or thought about yet. So you also asked within graduate school how to create a sense of belonging. So when you introduced me, you mentioned that I'm the, Lucy mentioned that I'm the director for this graduate degree program in ecology that only started in July. So I haven't done as much as I would like yet, but one of the very first things I did was create a group to write a diversity strategic plan with a mix of graduate students and faculty members. And I asked them to really think deliberately about how to create more of a sense of belonging as part of the work that they're doing. And they've done things like surveying the graduate students to find out what the needs are. And then we're going to take the plan, which I'm going to get the first update on in a couple of days, and run it through a good colleague and friend of mine who's an associate vice president in the diversity office at the university. So I think that there can be a tendency for well-meaning white folks like me to create plans that don't actually work and can even be harmful. But there's a ton of scholarship on how to do this work well. And so we need experts to evaluate what we suggest and make sure that it's sound in terms of the latest scholarship on diversity inclusion. And some of the folks on the committee are do have some of that expertise, and some folks are people of color as well. And so those perspectives also help tremendously. Something I'm doing at the faculty level, which I hope to also implement with graduate students, is we've created some mentoring circles that are aimed at women on the faculty. And we have an opt-in circle for women of color. So because, as Gillian said, there's so few women of color at the institution altogether, just being able to be in a group where you're not the only one can be a really refreshing and supportive thing to have. And so people can opt into that group if they want to, and have that community of people who have perhaps experienced similar things, see the racism that white folks might not see. And so I hope to implement another such thing like that at the graduate student level for this graduate degree program in ecology as well.
Thanks for this answer. The next question is for Beatrice. And so you are a postdoc, and I feel usually grad students and postdocs are painfully aware of all the mental health issues we are facing in academia. And do you feel that diversity and mental health are actually two questions that might be related to each other, or not that independent like from each other as we might think they are, and maybe that improving one will improve also the other. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm going to echo what the other speakers have said. I want to acknowledge to be here. It's an honor. Thank you to all the people here. About your question, I would say that, yes, I think that having decreasing disparity would improve all the overall environment in academia. And that's why we have to have these discussions. So yes, of course, disparities, situations that any person at any level are suffering, is going to impact in their mental health and then in the overall community. I do think that there are issues that should be addressed together in all the extent in which they overlap. Also, we cannot put them in the same sack. Not every health issue experienced by everybody is directly related by not an inclusive environment. To put it on nowadays, example that I'm receiving a lot of emails from foreigner postdocs from the PDI, so I'm serving in the postdoctoral committee, and there's a lot of anxiety related with visas right now, and that's not something related with the academic environment directly. So I think we have to recognize that there is an overlap, and the healthier your mental is, the best you can perform your duties, but not all the mental issues come from disparities exactly related. So given said that, I do think that one of the things we have to start recognizing is mental health problems are an issue, and we have to start letting the people being able to say that they have anxiety or they are suffering from stress related from structure in academia, or for example, one thing that I keep hearing from graduate students is how stressful prelims are. So we have to start to recognize as a community that this profession has a lot of impact in our mental health, and leave the space for people to speak up about how they're feeling.
Thank you, Beatrice, for your answer. So we have another question for Sima, and actually, we have heard so much about the representation in the academia, but we would like to actually know your point of view outside of academia. So how do you see the representation of minority groups in your field, and how you will support those groups to be better represented?
Thanks, Miguel, and thanks to all the organizers for inviting me to participate. I feel a little bit out of place as someone who's left academia, but I think that we see a lot of the same issues in industry. And so I work as a data scientist, and really I still consider that my field is ecology and evolution. I studied lizard ecology and evolution, Yosemite, and that was definitely a huge part of my identity and remains a huge part of my identity. But something that Gillian said in her talk that resonated and that I've seen before is that there's just not a diverse pool of people, of candidates to pull from for like software engineering positions or other positions in industry. And that's just not true. I think it's just easier to find people in the more overrepresented groups, but there are pools of candidates out there looking. And so I think something that I've continually gone back to and worked with postdocs and graduate students is this issue of how do you reconcile your identity in academia after you leave? Just because it is a numbers problem where there aren't enough positions to continue in academia. And so how do we increase that inclusion of, if you have built your identity around your research question and you want to continue to be involved, like, does your identity just cease to exist? Or is there a way to continue to involve people after if there aren't any available positions for them? And I think that what I've seen is we need to change the culture a little bit. And I'm wondering if it's not so much an issue of not having enough interest in students like undergraduates pursuing STEM fields. It seems like, based on the research that I've seen, that students will enter STEM fields, but Latinx and Black students tend to leave STEM majors more often than their white counterparts. And part of that is just this culture that is kind of ingrained of belonging and like having to kind of fight it out, having to prove that you are the best when there's all of this other baggage that comes with being an underrepresented minority group, that you have to work extra hard to be seen as the best to be able to get to the same positions. And so for our positions in industry and in tech, software engineering, we see something very similar, but something I've been really interested in is increasing diversity in academia as someone who's outside of academia by making it more visible how you can continue to be involved and how we're trying to patch this leaky bucket where we continue to support people who want to do biodiversity research even from outside of academia.
Thanks, Sima. So again, everyone, if you have questions, don't hesitate. We have some time to get them. I actually have a question for Gillian from one of our attendees. So the question is, as a minority student passionate about both ecology and art, I'm wondering how you have found a balance between your scientific and art practices throughout your career. Where have you found synergies between the two fields?
Thank you so much for that question. And because I have my own PhD advisor on the line, she'll probably will get a bad case of the giggles, but I actually drew pretty much all of my figures in my dissertation. I draw bumblebees all the time, and I actually really like drawing dragonflies. So what art helps me do to think about, and also getting to Sima's conversation about the non-professional identity. So I'm not a professional artist. I think I can identify as an artist. I do draw my research subjects because it helps me visually see the taxonomy, and it opens up these incredible detail. I mean, the back of a dragonfly is so complex. It has so many different colors and patterns and shapes and so forth that trying to imitate that is a wonderful artist challenge. So I think art is a way of seeing, and science is a way of asking questions. And sometimes by seeing, you can ask more questions. You know, so a huge part of biodiversity, for example, is on the patterns of butterfly wings and the patterns of bees and how this represents diversity within pollinators, who's doing what and why they're doing that and how that relates to food security. The artist's eye lets you see that pattern and helps you think about the importance of that pattern. whether it's just patterns of color, patterns of design. And that's a science question. So I think too often we tend to put art in one bucket and science in another bucket, but yet art really allows you to ask science questions because it's a way of seeing. And some people are visual seers, some people are, more auditory, seers, and, can think about, the music of birdsong and can remember bird songs and can think about in terms of a musical sense. Me, I have to have a pen in my hand and draw it. So I'd really love to encourage people who are artists to think about science, because it's such a way to open the doors to a different field. It gives you that way to see the complexity in the environment, which is so beautiful. It's so much a reflection of different creations and how art lets you see that. And more importantly, it lets students express it. So one last thing is what we do in one of our projects is we actually have students draw their research topics and get some pretty funny renditions. I think my favorite was the blob that was supposed to be a manatee. Manatees are pretty hard to draw. They're just blobs with noses. But that allows those students to think about manatees and think about, this whole creature, where it lives, what it does do. It really is a blob that floats around and eats potatoes. But it opened that world of the manatee to those students just to think about it. So I really appreciate that question, because I think we need to think about interdisciplinarity, and art is one of the ways of simply asking questions on what you see in the field.
Thank you, Gillian. So we just got one question from YouTube. So, and please feel free to answer this question, guys. So there is one person which is a university student. So she's asking, he's asking, what can I do to better support diversity and minority groups in ecological science? So I don't know if you guys want to jump in, to answer this question. Feel free. One of the panelists. So, yeah. Any volunteers? Otherwise,
I can say something. I think supporting diversity in academia is part of making more visible the opportunities that you get after you have your degree, whether that's you go into a postdoc, you get a faculty position, or something else. And I think that for me, the mental health is super important, and a huge source of uncertainty, which is just kind of built into academia, is you don't know where your postdoc is going to be, you don't know what the faculty position will be that'll be the best fit, and having that be at the forefront and be very open, that is part of the discussion throughout graduate school with your advisors, is super important, just to help you feel more resilient, because your research, things can blow up all the time. But if you know that you are working towards something, you're gaining these skills and developing yourself as a scientist and your identity as a scientist, it's a little bit easier to tackle that uncertainty. And I think that that would help attract a lot more of a diverse graduate population to know that no matter what happens, you are going to derive value from your experience as a graduate student and in academia.
Thank you very much, Sima. Is there anyone else that would like to say something about this question? Otherwise, we have another question.
Yeah, you seem to.
Yeah, I guess my recommendation would be to get engaged. And by engaging, you don't need to actually get a full position service in a committee, but just by going to events or dropping ideas, or just participate in some activity, even it's just one time, going to school, giving a talk, or just helping a group in the field, or just if they are organizing a panel like this, send a question. All of these activities, even it seems really small, they can be really helpful, because from my experience now as serving in a committee, at least you are always narrow by your ideas. So every time that someone fresh came in, just by giving ideas, it's super helpful.
Thank you, Betty. Emilio, would you like to say something about this?
Very quickly, I was going to say that I think there are a couple of things. I think that it depends a lot on what level of student a student is in. I think one of the best things that undergraduates can do, for instance, is just ask questions and try to create a culture of expectations with very probing but seeming, fake naive questions like, there's nothing wrong with asking the department chair, why don't we have a lot of minority faculty? Why don't we ever get members of underrepresented groups as our speakers? What is the department doing? So creating an expectation that this is something that should be done. As a graduate student, I think it's possible to do that too. I'm always worried that we're putting too much pressure to completely revolutionize the way we've been doing things on people who are at the point in their careers which are the most stressful, the most difficult, in which they're the least politically on the most politically shaky ground. Professionally, things are kind of open, but a lot of this has been shaped by, I don't know if people know who Richard Tapia is. He's a famous mathematician, recipient of the National Medal of Science at Rice University, who's just done an absolutely remarkable job with getting underrepresented students, particularly Latino students, into mathematics, PhDs in mathematics. And my first year as an assistant professor, I got to give a presentation at the National Science Board. And in fact, when I went into the room, I sat down in the audience waiting for my turn to speak. And the chair of the National Science Board, who'd invited me, very politely came over and said, if you wouldn't mind, Emilio, you're at the big table with us. And it was this really overwhelming moment, right? Because I had Shirley Chisholm on one side and I had Richard Tapia on the other side of me. And afterwards, I went up to Professor Tapia and I said, look, I'm a brand new faculty member. I don't ever think that I'll be able to do what you've done. But what can I do to get part, way there? What can I do to make sure that I am not the, one of the few Latino ecologists that are out there right now? I really want to do something. What can I do right now? And he stood back for a second, took a deep breath, and he came back and he said, get tenure. You're no use to us if you're unemployed. And I think that was a really valuable lesson too, right? Which is that there's real value in being the person that other people can look to, and to take a little of the pressure off of yourself until you're in a position where you can try to invest a little more heavily. And I know that slows things down, and I know people don't like to hear that sometimes, but I think given the pressure that we're putting, especially graduate students under, I think it's okay to be a little bit selfish too, and expect that other people who are in a position of relative professional comfort, people at my career stage, make those changes as opposed to putting the responsibility on themselves.
See, Miguel, could I make a quick comment? Sorry, I didn't see how to raise my hand. I apologize. I want you to agree with Emilio and just sort of add to, I think one point of advice is that I think is really important is you need to get yourself a soul mentor, not an academic mentor, a soul mentor, somebody who can be that sounding board to help you move forward. Because like for African Americans, there's so few of us in the field. If I only came to Colorado State because there was another African American here, I mean, my pool of employment would be so narrow among the academic institutions. So some of my soul mentors are at University of Berkeley, University of Florida, they're all over the place. But that's an important sounding board to have that soul mentor who may be in the sciences. And especially when you make that jump from academic to non-academic or vice versa. I still talk to my Park Service soul mentors all the time. And I think we tend to tell students that mentor has to be within their discipline. And I think that's such a mistake, that the mentor has to be someone that allows you to excel in science writ large and in your particular discipline, because we all shift disciplines around. I mean, you talk to most tenured people and they may have studied one or two things during their course of their academic career and not just one thing. I've studied insects to bison to butterflies to prairie dogs. I mean, all over the place. So for students, really think about that soul mentor. Who helps you get through the process is so important.
So I have another question. Here's a question that perhaps is provocative. We learned that women are no longer underrepresented in fields related to biodiversity. However, this shift is relatively recent. And we are also hearing about the mental health issues of being a minority and experiencing discrimination I think there is a large gap between generations in the experience of discrimination and mental health related to those issues within the majority group of white women. I wonder if older white women can identify in some respects with the discrimination experienced by underrepresented groups better than younger white women. For me, I feel that we do need to step back and celebrate the advances of women at the same time that we furiously tackle diversifying biodiversity science. These experiences older women have are actually relevant to the current goals. Does anyone have any thought on that?
I do.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. When I hear that women are no longer a minority on sciences and especially in leadership positions, I don't see how this could be a homogeneous sentence. And it looks like a sentence that comes, for example, from developed countries that have already achieved a collective mindset that supports this. But for example, as a Latina woman who comes from Brazil, who was educated, born, and who is trying to get a job in Brazil, I see that gender equality is far from sight. And I kind of feel uncomfortable with this notion that maybe women have already, and women as a whole, are not making this cut into sexual orientations, ethnics, and social income, for example, if you're a first generation or if you come from a well-established and a family that can support you, there are all these differences. But I don't think that the status of gender equality in academia is something that is a phenomenon worldwide. This probably relates to specific fields. And in this sense, I feel like specifically related to the question that if older women could relate to the burden that is over minorities as a generational thing, this is something specific to maybe a socioeconomic context. I don't know if I made myself clear. And I hope other panelists can incorporate and complement my response.
If I could jump in, I put a comment in the chat box. This is Gillian, and I realized that the YouTube, I'm not sure if they see the chat box or not, but my comment on women being no longer underrepresented is specific to the US. So that is data from the National Science Foundation. And the other thing to be very mindful of, especially in this audience, it is specific to US citizens. And with all the politics aside, the right and the wrong, et cetera, because it's very, in some ways in the academic institutions, it's a little bit harmful for that type of statistics to come out, especially for the Hispanic and Spanish speaking populations where you have a mixture, and more so for the Asian populations, where you have a lot of mixture of international people, international heritage, first generation, et cetera. But I think the underlying message is this sea shift between being part of an underrepresented group to being not overrepresented, but being part of the majority for white women is very important just to think through, because your role has changed. You're in the position now to be a champion for others. You have a different voice. You have a voice of more power, because there were more likely to be other white women in that faculty making your tenure decision than for that woman of color. So how do you as an ally then reach back and help that woman of color and recognize that her challenges are different than yours? So I think that's the key point, and that's the key shift that is very different today. So when I talk about security and safety, my white female colleagues are not thinking the same thing. And that's important for just all to recognize, not plus or minus, just recognize. So I think that shift between being an ally and being part of the minority group is a really important shift to make, because it helps us all. And it's something that we all need to celebrate, that we have more people who can be in a position of helping us move forward in the future. And that's what we all need. You know, we need a hand forward and we need to reach a hand backward at the same time to get to equity.
Thank you, Gillian. So actually, Emilio has a question for you. I don't know, Emilio, if you want to unmute your microphone and ask directly to Gillian.
Yeah, actually, it's a question really for the whole panel too afterwards, if people would like to pipe up. Jen, you mentioned something really important. You had these 3 points that you thought were really important to have, you know, the possibility for success for underrepresented scientists or scientists to be getting engaged. And I wanted to see what you thought about one other one, and that is that I know in my situation, I was very fortunate to have family support for a career in kind of environmental science and environmental biology. I think too often what we find in a lot of households is that you're good at math and science, and what that means is there's a lot of pressure from family and maybe teachers that means medicine or engineering, you know, kind of these traditional highly respected careers, especially those of us, you know, whose roots are, for instance, in Latin America. And so in fact, I was going to highlight here, and I'll put it in the chat and I'll put it in the YouTube link as well. My colleague here, our colleague Nia Morales here at the University of Florida, has written she's got a really great paper on perceptions of environmental conservation careers in diverse university students, and another one on minority students, in which she did focus groups. And one of the biggest barriers that she found was, you know, family looking down on the idea of going outside and getting muddy and dirt. What are you, chasing snakes? So what kind of job? That's not a job. I mean, if you're good at, why aren't you going to be a doctor, mija? And we all understand that, right? And so I'm wondering if you know, what kind of support broadly you had from family. Did they give you the side eye when this was something that you announced you were doing? And then more broadly to the panel, did people find that they had support from family to try something like this, or did they have to overcome the lack of family support to move their way into environmental careers?
Thanks for this answer. We have an extra question about a student anyway, we often talk about the importance of role models and representation as a first generation student, even though there may have been some scientists who looked like me in the field. I wasn't exposed to those scientists until later in my career. Do you have any thoughts on how to make role models in our field more visible to underrepresented communities earlier? Maybe Ruth, you could go if you have any thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that who we invite for seminars, for example, matters so much, and I'm organizing a career panel to think about, you know, all the different sorts of careers that folks can go into with a degree in ecology within and outside of academia, and who is invited to that is also really crucial. And so we're inviting a real diversity of folks so that people can see that they can see themselves in that group and can see themselves working in that field. And something I do as an instructor is I try to make sure that the science that I'm talking about, one, I try to very much humanize it. I talk about the authors of the work in addition to the science that they do. And I make sure that I am showing science from all over the planet and from all different sorts of people. And I find pictures of them if I can, you know, whether it's white men or Latina women, you know, everybody in the room can see there are so many different people doing this science everywhere, and I could be part of that if I want to be.
I think something else about finding mentors is very rarely, if you reach out to someone and ask them to meet with you, or ask them after you've met with them a couple times if they would want to serve as your mentor, will someone say no? Usually that's like a pretty, like, you feel pretty honored if someone asks you to be their mentor. And so I think that something that I've tried to do as a graduate student and that I've tried to advise other grad students that I've worked with is, if you see someone who has a position that you're really excited about and you want to know what their story is, if you reach out to them directly, like very often, they will be more than happy to help.
I just have a little bit of something to add. I so much agree with what Seema said, and I got a little bit distracted in my answer on some of the other parts, but in terms of that mentorship piece, it is so true. And it is going back to that student's question from his picture, it looked like a white man. White men, white women need to be prepared to be mentors for everybody. And that is incumbent upon folks in those groups to educate themselves to how to mentor everybody well, not just people who look like them or have similar backgrounds to them. But like Seema said, everybody would be happy and flattered to be a mentor of almost any student coming to them. Anybody who asks, I can't imagine ever saying no.
If I could jump in again for a second, and I'm sorry, I still haven't figured out how to raise my hand. I'm sorry, I apologize about that. First on the question of mentor, there was a poll that went out very recently among Black ecologists and others, and it was a very simple question. And I think that gets to an earlier question that was asked on, I think by Lucy from the audience, about older women versus younger women and how those roles differ. So one of the questions was simply, can you remember the first African-American professor you had, and when did that occur? Right, and for most of us, the answer was we had none for the older group, or the first one that I had was in graduate school. So I think, and it wasn't even in my discipline, it was a mathematics statistics guy. So 0 in undergraduate, 0 through most of my graduate career. So I think when we think about, and Ruth, thank you for saying that really well, we can't wait for these 1 or 2 Black people to show up to mentor every Black student that's on your campus. But that's a lot of the mentoring has to be a task and ability to think about how that person's voice is moving through academia. That's so important. Because I think it's so important to recognize that you may have a soul mentor, and then you have an academic mentor, and you probably need both, or you maybe need several. Maybe you need an art mentor, but all those things help you, your self-identity and your mental health. And I really appreciate the conversations about mental health on making it through the field. You need to have a variety of mentors that serve different purposes. But I wanted to just say one real quick thing back to Emilio in terms of the issue of family. And I think there's a huge implicit bias that we say when students of color don't go into a field because of money. Because we have this assumption that a family doesn't think that an academic career is good, or a family, regardless to what the discipline is or whether they understand what the discipline is. The fact that you're a professor for many families is pretty cool. And how much money you make is not really the issue. But I think we carry that bias into when we talk to students that, oh, it's about the money. You're not going to make much money. Well, I just want to tell you that I took an enormous pay cut coming from federal to academics. And I still was so surprised. And how many people will say, well, you could have earned more money in academia. No, I earned almost double in the National Park Service than I do in academics. So I think we carry that bias forward, and we tell it to our students that if you don't have your families don't understand you can make money in this, I think is such a fallacy. They see first, are you a scientist? Are you an academic person? Regardless to what your discipline is. My family has no clue what I do for a living, and they don't care. They're so proud that I'm a professor. That's all they care about. So I think we need to sort of watch that implicit bias and make sure we unpack it so our students are not deterred by that.
I think, Gillian, just following up on the implicit bias, because I'm really glad that you brought that up. The question that somebody asked about, like, do older white women identify with the experience of underrepresented minorities today? And I have to think about this for a while, but I think that their experience, the experience of older white women, maybe in like the 60s, 50s, 70s, trying to be in academia is very different. And right now, I think, Gillian, you had mentioned, now that there are more women in academia as professors, they can serve as they can serve as allies to help bring these issues to the forefront and make sure that we're talking about them. I think that we shouldn't just put like all of the weight on women in academia. I think that there are definitely implicit biases, like even amongst white men in academia. And really something that would be super valuable is having some sort of like implicit bias training, like setting up our expectations for like a department's culture, making it very clear and easier for people to have the tools to be able to recognize those implicit biases, which we all have, which are there, but know what to do about them, and take some of the pressure off white women, young faculty, and trying to promote diversity in the department, and try to make it more of like a culture department-wide effort.
Thank you, Sima, and everyone who answered this question. So we're kind of running out of time. We're afraid about this, like having this interesting conversation. So we would like to know, like, if you have like any final key messages that you would like to share with the audience that we have right now. So I don't know if you want to go to participate, like the 6 people who were like talking. So say a final message to conclude this panel before we leave. So anyone, can you volunteer? So no volunteers. So I will pick the first one I see on my screen. Is Gillian?
I'm sorry, Miguel, did you say Lillian or Gillian?
Okay, you can go ahead. Yeah.
You had said Gillian?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't listen. But anyway, if I were to closure this panel, I would say that relating to the COVID issues, coping with the current and long-term consequences of this pandemic will require from all of us, but especially from our leadership community, from our leadership, from our scientific leadership, courageous, conscious, and diversity-targeted action at all levels, from the individual to the community and even to affirmative policies.
Thank you, Lillian.
Okay, thank you for that. I think my final sort of thought would be, find a soul mentor. I think it's important that we have a community to move forward in science disciplines. I think science is going to become more and more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. It's going to include more social, more that soul mentor that helps you make that connection and that transition to where new science is. Sustainability is going to be a fundamentally different science. It's a global science. It means working in multicultural spaces where everybody thinks a little bit differently. So having that soul mentor, whoever that is just such an amazing part of moving forward and staying well centered with your mental health at the same time.
Thank you, Gillian. So anyone else who wants to share like a final thoughts?
I think mental health is just super important, just making sure you're keeping that in mind, having a mentor, and then also just making sure that you are thinking about yourself, not just in terms of your research, but in terms of other aspects of your life that are important, so you can build this resilience and get the most out of your graduate career that you possibly can.
I guess if I can add, I would like recommend everybody to get engaged in discussions. So be open to talk and get engaged in these issues just by talking and joining different discussions. That would help a lot.
I guess I would say that something that I think is really important is to have a long-term plan whether you're in graduate school or a postdoc, or like me, like I would like to change this program that I'm now part of, and to have a long-term plan for what I want that to become and specific steps for how to get there. And just, there can be so many distractions along the way, but that long-term plan will help people in their individual careers and will help us change the discipline as a whole.
Thank you very much. Simon, Emilio, would you like to share like some final thoughts?
Well, I guess I'll say that I wholeheartedly endorse the notion that you have to be that mental health is key. The relationship between mental health and physical health, and being in a position where we're able to take on some of this work because it can be grueling, and that as part of that, as part of that mental health, it's okay to occasionally be selfish if necessary, I guess, and focus on that schoolwork or those professional ambitions. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And the other thing I'd like to say, which is very difficult, and I know people are resistant in some ways to it, but the idea that we should demand that the people who are in a position to make changes make those changes, right? And I know people, I know that a lot of those people are comfortably ensconced in their positions, and so they may not make those changes, but we do a disservice to the people who are in the most tenuous position by expecting them to do the bulk of the hard, exhausting work. And so I think that it is perfectly acceptable to expect and ask others to make the changes that they should be doing. They should be doing their jobs. So we need to figure out a way to make that happen and have those people who have the decision-making authority be responsible for the change that we expect them to implement.
Thanks, everyone. So I think that's it. That's the end of the panel discussion. Thanks again very much to all the speakers for being a part of that. It was really helpful from my perspective. I'm talking on my behalf, but it was really nice to have your insights on all those questions and have different perspectives as well. And so if everyone is fine with that, it would be amazing if you could turn on your videos and we would do a screenshot to just have everyone, as it is the last day of the RCN meeting. So I don't know if I'm the one doing the screenshot or we are, or I.
I'm taking one and other people can take two.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, Lucy and Miguel, and all of the team of the committee of students who organized this panel. For those of you who didn't know, when the idea of organizing this panel came about, it was very clear that we wanted to make a panel led by the students with questions by them to leverage their advanced personal and professional. And I thought that we got a lot of insight by hearing all of your reflections on the topic. And I would like to personally thank each one and every one of you for attending, but also especially our panelists and the organizers. I think we're leaving with lots to think about and new ideas as well. And with this, it's 1:03 on the 4th day of our RCN, so we're meeting on time. I would like to thank everyone for participating on, throughout these days. We will definitely